Perfect. All right. Hello, my name is Sarah Milligan. I am the chair of the Oklahoma Archivists Association Education Committee. I'm also the head of the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program, which is in the Oklahoma State University Library. So this is part 5 of the 6-part virtual workshop series, Archiving 101, Fundamentals of Collection Management. This is a program of the Oklahoma Archivists Association, which is an organization to promote networking and education for archives professionals, students, and record keepers in Oklahoma. So this series is also sponsored by the Oklahoma Department of Libraries and the Oklahoma Historical Records Advisory Board, with funding support from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission. We will be recording today's workshop for sharing later on in the Oklahoma Archivists Association website. So you can see past recorded webinars on the website under the resources tab. And if you weren't able to attend previous sessions in the series, but you want to go back and review that content, those are also available under that resources tab. While I have your attention, I also wanted to let you know about an upcoming OAA workshop series that we just got scheduled and finalized. It will be December 8th at 2 p.m. We will be presenting a workshop, Introduction to Scanning, from Stuart Rochford, who's the Digital Library Center Manager at Florida State University. More on that soon on the OAA website and email and social media and all the places. Keep your eyes open. But if that's something you're interested in, you might save the date. So on to today. Today's workshop is session 5, which is access and outreach. So we will be talking today about administering access, reference services, advocacy, promotion, evaluation. Those are all really big things. So keep your ears open. And we're really grateful to have Kera Newby share this information with us today. Kera Newby is the director of the Dickinson Research Center and curator of archives at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. She's earned her MLIS from the University of Oklahoma and is the current president of the Oklahoma Archivists Association. Hey. She works to ensure diverse and vibrant archives that make available and promote the stories of all people. Without further ado, I will pass the Zoom baton over to Kera.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I appreciate that wonderful introduction. So like Sarah said, we're going to be talking about access and outreach today. First, though, I want to thank all of our sponsors who have helped make this possible, as well as I want to do a shout out and thank Sarah personally for being an incredible education committee chair, and just all of the excellent work that she's done to provide really amazing programming for OAA members and people within the library and museum world. So just special thank you out to Sarah for all of the excellent work that she's done. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk about access and outreach. Like Sarah said in my introduction, I truly believe that access and outreach is the core of archives. This is why we do what we do. And so I have quite a few slides and I have a lot of concepts to talk about today. So as Sarah said, we're going to be doing, let me see how, okay, there we go, sorry. So this is really our recap of the previous sessions and our agenda that we're going to be talking about today. So the previous sessions that we've done have really all built on each other to the point where now we can talk about how we make these collections accessible and how we tell people about them. So we're going to start with access and then move on to outreach. As I said, access is absolutely a core concept in archives. If there's a repository that collects, that brings in collections, accessions them, arranges them, describes them, creates a perfect preservation environment for them, but then puts them on the shelves and no one ever is able to access it, that's not an archive, that's a storage vault. And so here is why this is really why access is so important, right? Everything archivists do is to provide access. Every decision you're making along the way has something to do and it can be tied to access. Even in the very first conversation that you're having with a potential donor, right? Like they're telling you about the collection that you could bring into the repository, and you're thinking about one of the things you're thinking about is, okay, well, how am I going to make this accessible? Whenever you, like Holly was talking about a couple of weeks ago, whenever you are like building your, perfect environment for your collections, or as close that you can get, right? You're doing that so that the collections will be available in the future for people to access. Whenever you are arranging a collection, you're thinking about how people can access this the best. And when you're writing your description, literally the reason for writing description is to provide access to a collection. So every stage along the way has something to do with access. And that's why it's so critical. Additionally, access is an archival ethical responsibility. This on the screen right here is the entire paragraph about access from SAA's Code of Ethics. Just glancing through there, you can see there's some pretty strong language when it comes to access, right? There's just not a lot of gray area. Either something is accessible or it's not accessible. There are some situations where things being inaccessible is okay, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But really what you want to ensure is that you are providing equitable access to collections. So what that really means, what we're talking about there is making sure that if someone comes in and is able to access the collection, someone else is also able to access that collection, that you're not giving priority treatment to specific people, and that you're making your collections as accessible as possible. So like most other things in archives and along this process, access needs a policy. You need to have some kind of foundational document that supports your access activities. So this can be either a standalone document, or it can be combined with your reference service policy, which we're actually going to talk about in a bit, because most archives really have them as one document. It's just kind of easier that way, and it makes everything really transparent to users. So essentially this policy just outlines all of your expectations for your users who are accessing the materials. It gives you like support whenever you need it. So if a researcher is mishandling collections or anything like that, you can go back to that document and say, you signed this document that states how you're supposed to be treating the materials. You're not treating them correctly. You need to leave. And it just helps everybody stay accountable. And then also too, as you're drafting or editing or updating an access policy, really try to consider just like not reinventing the wheel. Jump online, look at other archives, access or reference policies, particularly any kind of repository that's similar to your repository. Look at what kind of special considerations they've added into their reference service policy or access policy. And see if that is relevant to your needs as well. You might have needs that are completely singular to any other repository, and that's okay. Just make that clear in your access policy. So there are going to be times where materials are inaccessible for one reason or another. It's really going to vary by repository. In a more traditional type archive, restrictions are mostly going to come from donors. You're going to be working with donors, and usually I would say in the early stages of talking with donors, they will probably bring up something about, well, there's this group of materials and I don't want anyone to see it for 50 years. And when that happens, it's time to put your negotiator hat on and work with with them to try to make the materials accessible at an earlier state. Or if you're able to, just talk them out of putting restrictions on it at all. Your role is really to make these materials accessible. And there could be too, something to consider is if someone approaches you with a collection and they want to restrict the entire collection for a certain amount of time for one reason or another, you need to think about how that's going to affect your repository. So if you're short on space and this is a large collection, bringing in something that people aren't going to be able to access for a really long time probably isn't a great idea. There are ways, again, you'll need to negotiate with the donors, but that's just something to keep in mind. Corporate or university archives are going to have their own standards of access. And then there's also just going to be legal restrictions sometimes on materials. So for example, presidential papers are exempt from public release for 5 years after the end of an administration. And then they're subject to FOIA requests. So I'm not really, in this presentation, I'm not really going to talk about FOIA, except in this moment, and that's the Freedom of Information Act, where people can request access to materials that are not publicly accessible. And then again, you could have restrictions that are put on place on materials in community archives or other kinds of repositories where only certain members of the community are able to access those materials. So for like tribal nations, for instance, you could have a time where you could have a set of materials where only like elders in the community are able to access those materials. So these are just kind of a variety of different restrictions that can be placed on materials and ways that just things that you need to keep in mind when you're thinking about accessibility of collections. So how do we really like make collections accessible, right? Jennifer talked last week about description, arrangement and description, and really description is kind of the core, it's kind of the gateway into accessibility. So once you have your description of a collection, once you have your finding aid, there are different ways that you can present that to the public. So for like smaller institutions or institutions that don't have IT help or things of that nature, maybe they just don't have a website. One of the things you can do is just print off your finding aids and keep them in your reading room and have people come visit you, or you could digitize them and email them out to people as they request materials or whenever you're talking with them. So that's kind of one way. And then next we have where maybe your repository has a website, so you're able to put things up online, but maybe there aren't the funds to get a database system or anything like that. Maybe there's just not, again, like the IT support or something that you need to do that kind of thing. But you have your website, so you're able to put up PDFs of finding aids or Excel spreadsheets, or you can code them and make them accessible through HTML tags or CSS, something like that, to where the text of the finding aids are available online for people to find and look through. And then finally, we have the sort of like database system where people can come in and keyword search through your finding aids and see if there's anything that's relevant to their research needs. So all three of these provide access to collections. It's really just in your repository deciding what's best for your users and what your repository can do. So finding the happy medium between that is really what you should try to focus on. So after you have made all these decisions, you're ready to finally allow access to collections. You're in for the reference services part of archives. So the traditional type of access or reference service is people physically coming to the archive and looking through materials. But particularly since COVID, a lot of reference has kind of turned more to digital reference. So what I'm going to be talking about over this next section of reference services is applicable both to in-person and digital situations. There are times where things might be a little bit different, but basically the steps that you take along the way are pretty much the same. One's just maybe through phone or through email, and the other's just going to be in person. So these are three core components to reference services. You have your reference interview, you need a space that has certain levels of security, and then different procedures that we'll talk about when it comes to reference. So the phrase reference interviews, I think, sounds pretty formal, right? Sounds like something that, you're going to be like sitting down and having this like kind of intense conversation, but it's not that at all. It's literally just a customer service interaction where you're talking with someone about what it is that they need to access at your repository. So again, it's customer service. A lot of all of this, everything to do with access is customer service. So really what you want to do is just have a conversation with them. Again, this can be through email, this can be over the phone, this can be in person. And they're going to tell you what they're researching, what they're interested in looking at. If you're lucky and you have online finding aids, they might have already looked at your online finding aids and they can already tell you what collections, what boxes, what folders they want to look at. But most of the time people just need support. So they might just email in and say, this is my research topic. Do you have anything about this? And so then at that point you can lead them to certain finding aids that might have materials, finding aids for collections that might have materials that will interest them. Or, you can kind of like help guide them through the process. It's really vital though that you do not do their research for them. They need to be able to look at the finding aids of collections that maybe you suggest, which is just fine, but they need to be the ones to say, these are specific collections and folders that I want to look at. When you kind of push that line and you start saying like, just look at this folder, or I digitized this folder for you, and you don't point them to the finding aid, you're really restricting their access to that collection. Part of the sort of joy of research, at least in my opinion, is just discovery, like this happenstance kind of thing. And you really remove that opportunity from your researchers whenever you decide what's going to be relevant for them. So you want to avoid making those decisions. Even if you know the exact thing that they need is in this one folder, you still want to point them to the finding aid so that they can see what are the folders around that one thing, because maybe they have another project they're working on that you don't know about, that another folder around there is going to have materials for it or something. So again, just try not to don't do people's research for them. Allow them to access the collection descriptions that you work really hard to create, and have them decide what's going to be relevant for their research purposes. So when it comes to security during reference services, one of the things that you really need to focus on, like space and materials. So what space are you going to be using to facilitate this access? In some institutions, there is a dedicated researcher room, and maybe there's dedicated staff that stays and attends to the researchers all of the time. And other institutions, so like here at the Cowboy, we have a table that people use, and one of us will sit at our desk and monitor them while we continue to work on other projects. And then in some institutions, it might be like a converted closet or something. It's just some kind of space that where researchers can use to access the materials. But the things that you need to really be aware of is like these, the materials are going to be existing in this space. So you want to make sure that all of your environmental monitoring and everything happens in that space as well. You want it to be a stable environment for the materials. You want to make sure that you can see the researchers, you can see what they're doing. So you don't want to have them sitting with their back to you where you can't see what they're doing with their hands, things of that nature. There's just kind of some things to think about whenever you're choosing your space or you're choosing how to organize your space. Again, like I said, on things to consider, think about how big your space is, and maybe you can only accommodate 2 researchers at a time. For us here in the DRC, we can only accommodate 1, 2 if we're lucky, but really we can only accommodate 1 at a time. And then make sure that you think about your space in creative ways. So right now we can only accommodate 1, but maybe I could go and look at our space and think about how we could fit another table in, and if that would even be relevant, right? If that's even something that we need to do. So then when it comes to security of the materials, this is where you're really going to lean on your policy, and most of that, all of kind of the security of materials is going to be found. All of those points are going to be found in your policy. And some things to consider is in your reading room, whenever you're doing reference services for materials, is how are you going to be safely duplicating them? Do you have a photocopier? Do you have a scanner or something of that nature where you can provide duplications? Do you need any specialized equipment in your reading room? So for us, we have a lot of negatives. So we have a wide range of light boxes and things that researchers are going to need to be able to actually utilize those negatives. And then another thing to think about is how you can utilize digitization in your reference services. So for example, if you have a researcher who has looked through the finding aids and decided that all they really need is this one folder, and you check the folder and there's like 2 things in it, do you really need that researcher to come to your physical space and handle those materials? Or can you digitize them and send it to the researcher? And that way the materials only are touched one time by one person, and it's, it's you, so how the materials are being handled. So it's just something to consider. So I've talked about this policy a couple of times and how crucial it is. And I just want to show you what we do here in the DRC at the Cowboy Museum. So it's a 3-page long researcher form, is essentially what we call it. It's available on our website, so people can actually just download it, fill it out, send it out to us, and then we create an appointment for them. That rarely happens. Most of the time, instead, though, it is where we are going to be walking them through the research process. We're going to be pointing them to finding aids and helping them find the materials that they need. So this is page 1. You can see we just have basic information, some directions of how to fill out the form. That's really important. That's really important to consider whenever you are making these forms publicly available. Not everyone has researched in an archive before, and so it's just important to give a couple of key points of how to do archival research. And then this is really our access policy. So it's 1 page. It's pretty small text, but it's only 1 page. We worked really hard to get it to only be 1 page. And it outlines everything we expect of our researchers, including how to make an appointment with us, when we need this form. So we need it at least 1 week before their scheduled appointment, all of the things that we expect out of them in the reading room, and then how they can get duplicates whenever they're here. So this is for us. This is our access policy, our research policy. This may not be applicable to your repository, and that's okay. But maybe there are a couple of things in there that would apply. And this is going to be available. Obviously, this will be available in my slides whenever they're sent out, but they're also going to be sent out with the mailing that's going to happen at the end of the series. And then our 3rd page is where our patrons can add in the materials that they're interested in looking at. So this page is really twofold. So this is for our researchers, for them to keep track of all of the things that they want to look at, but it's also for us to be able to look at and again, keep track of what they're looking at, so that if in a week's time we go to a folder that we know was accessed last week and there's something missing from it, we know who to talk to about that, right? It's also a good way to be able to gauge So it's also a good way to be able to gauge what collections are being utilized the most in your repository. So after we have researchers, we have a spreadsheet set up where we enter in all of this information. And at the end of the year, we can see which collections were accessed the most. And that tells us for the next year, what should we really be focusing on digitizing? What needs to be our focus, because all of these people are looking at this one collection. Maybe this is what we need to make available online, so that they maybe don't have to come in and physically research. So this is really kind of the overview of the reference service procedures. Your first step is actually that reference interview, but I didn't include it on here because you're naturally going to do that. If someone is contacting you to look at your materials, just naturally the things that you're going to ask them is going to be that reference interview. Again, these stages can be different for any repository, but in general sense, these are really the core functions of reference services. So here again, if you're doing digital reference services, you're pretty much going to follow these stages as well. So we've kind of talked about most of these, but the thing that I want to talk about most on this slide is the end of the visit. So just like you do your reference interview, you need to do an exit interview with your researchers. There are a lot of reasons for doing this. And again, this is just going to be a casual conversation. You're not going to sit down with them and say, okay, now we're going to be doing your exit interview. It's not going to be that at all. You're just going to be like casually talking with them to make sure that they found everything that they needed, because if they didn't, then they still have research needs, and maybe you can help them find something else that will be relevant. And then my favorite thing to ask is if they found anything unexpected. This is so important because as archivists, we would love to have the time to read through all of our collections. We want to know everything that's in our collections, but we don't have time to do that. There's no possible way to be able to do that. So it's nice to be able to utilize our researchers who have just spent time in the collections and learn more about what these collections house, right? So use your researchers as a resource to be able to discover new things in your collections. And it's going to come up more times. It's going to be more relevant than you think. It might not be the next week. It might not be the next year. It could be 5 years down the road, but you might get another researcher who's interested in something that, your current researcher found that just blew their mind, and you're going to remember that moment. And you're going to be able to point the future researcher back to that collection to be able to say, I know there's something that's going to help you in this collection. It also comes in handy when later we're talking about advocacy. It comes in handy to know about unexpected things in your collections. And then you just want to make sure that there aren't any other like future or further research needs that your patrons are going to need. So that's really the overview of access. And now we're going to move on to outreach. So outreach is really fun. I mean, I think outreach is really fun. Parts of access and parts of outreach are kind of similar to each other, which makes it nice to be able to talk about them in one presentation. But they are really separate entities and separate concepts. So access is all about people using the materials in a repository, and outreach is all about the repository telling people about materials. So outreach is essentially marketing, and again, it can be really fun. So we're going to start with advocacy, and I put this quote from Larry Hackman on here because it's pretty much the core of advocacy right there. It's just talking to people about your repository. So either they're able to then go on and talk to other people about your repository and have them support it in some way, or the person you're talking to directly will be able to support the repository in some way. So if you have a specific project you're working on or something, or just your repository just needs support in various ways, you just talk with people about it, and eventually you'll talk with someone who can do something to support your repository. again, so who are you going to be talking to? The most important one is just everyone. Just talk to everyone. Every conversation you have matters. Every time you talk about your repository matters. Everything you say about your repository matters. People remember the things that you say. It's just really important to always talk in a good light about your repository and know that every conversation you're having about it is you advocating for it. There's also kind of like internal advocacy. So that's going to be where if you are at a larger institution and you have, an executive team or just like lots of people that work in different departments, this is where you're really going to talk with them about how important your repository is. It can be pretty difficult to find out who are the key players that you need to be talking to make sure that they're talking about your repository in rooms where maybe you aren't in those rooms. That's really kind of your goal there, is making sure that when you aren't around, your repository is still being talked about in a good light and people are bringing you up and for all kinds of different situations. So one of the things I would suggest that would make it easier to figure out who internally you need to be advocating to is maybe you can hold a tour of the repository and have specific people from certain departments or something come down. You give a tour and you just watch for like who seems to be really engaged, who seems really interested in your repository, and then talk with them, advocate to them about it, let them know more about what you're doing, because if they're already enthusiastic from a tour, then they're going to be enthusiastic to talk about your repository to other people. This is something that we do with with the Cowboys board members. Whenever we have our board meetings, we host tours for our board members so that we can just put in front of them, this is how awesome we are. These are all the cool things that we're doing. And then they're able to take that information and tell other board members about it, about us. And then there's external advocacy. So this is essentially the exact same concept, but you're just kind of casting a wider net sometimes. You want to look at the community that you're
listening to a listening
you're
to a
going to want to
webinar.
look at thank you. You're going to want to look at the community that you're serving, or communities that you're serving, and see kind of who are the key players in this community who can really advocate for you, and then you advocate to them about your repository. So some tips for advocacy. I think probably one of the most important thing is to just know your repository. If you know a lot about your collections, if you know really interesting stories. So again, if you have a researcher who found something really bizarre in a collection, this is a great thing to use when you're doing advocacy. You really want to find like the human connection. You want to find some way that's going to make people be interested in your repository. So it's really important to have at least one favorite collection or favorite item or favorite story to tell. You want to collect these stories and have them in your back pocket so you can just like tell them and advocate for your repository at any point in time. Also too, I guarantee you, whenever you're talking to someone and you say that you work in an archive, after you explain what that means, they're gonna ask you, what's your favorite thing? What's your favorite thing in the collection? What's your favorite material or something like that? And so you wanna make sure that you have an answer to that. And then kind of moving into like knowing your community, this kind of gels together. You wanna make sure that the things that you're telling the people you're advocating to are relevant to them. So if you're talking with an artist group, maybe make your favorite collection be a collection about artists or like from an artist or something like that, so that they're able to find a connection to your repository and remember it, and they'll remember it better, right? And then finally, you just really want to be confident. You want to know that the work that you are doing is important. The work you're doing really matters, and you need other people to believe that too. So the more bold you are, the more confident you are, they're going to believe you, and they're going to advocate on your behalf to other people. So next we're going to talk about promotion. So advocacy is really kind of like a targeted act, right? You want to find specific people or groups of people who can support your institution in various ways, where promotion is really about kind of casting a wider net and saying like, this is what we have and it's super cool. This is through promotion is usually how people will most often find out about your repository and all of the different materials that they can access. But promotion is also about community. You need to know who it is you're serving, who is your audience, who are you doing this for? So you want to look at who are you serving? Who are you serving? Who is your audience? You need to know that before you're able to craft any kind of promotion. Why should they care about your repository? And how do they find you? Are you trying to promote your online resources? If so, maybe don't talk about your physical presence, your physical space, just focus on your online resources. If you want to talk about how you offer in-person research, then maybe point to your website, but make the most of your promotion be about your physical research capabilities. And then also too, you want to make sure that you are informing people about the different actions they can take in your repository. So they can research, they can order images, they can, look at your digital collections, whatever it may be. You want to make sure there's some kind of action item involved in your promotion that drives people to either to your website or to your repository, like the actual physical space. So I put together just some different ideas of ways that you can promote your repository. And also too, this isn't necessarily just about your repository as one entity. You can also do any of this for a specific collection. If there's a new collection you have that you're really excited about and you want a specific group of people to know about it, by all means, promote the heck out of it, right? Like make sure that group knows that you have this collection. It could, and the possibilities are really limitless. So it's just important to remember that promotion is a part of what we do, and it just helps people know what we have in our repositories. Also too, so we were talking about internally advocating earlier, right? But it's also important to do internal promotion. So this section is about outreach, but it's also important to think about inreach. So if you are at an organization that's fairly large, has, at least a couple of departments, and, your repository is a part of that, you want to try to think about how you're going to let everyone else know, everyone else in your institution know about how important your repository is. So obviously advocating is super important. Every time you're in a meeting, you want to talk positively about the different kinds of things that you're doing. But you can also do kind of different programming with your with people who are in your institution. So here at the Cowboy, we created a program, an in-reach program called Be an Archivist. And every October, except not this year and not last year because of COVID, hopefully we're going to be able to do it again next year, but I don't know, we'll see. We do this program every October because it's National Archives Month. And we set aside the mornings of one entire week, and we create little 30-minute pockets of time where staff can sign up to come down to the archive and work on a project that we are currently working on. So it involves them in our processes. It brings them down to our space and physically into our vault where they're able to see, our extensive collections, and it gives them a personal experience with the materials. It gives them an experience they're able to take away and talk about with other employees or their family or anyone really. It gives them just a foundational idea of what it is that we do. It also gives us an opportunity to talk more about the DRC, what we do, all these kind of things. So Be an Archivist is a really fun kind of program. You can do that obviously we do it from an internal perspective, but you could do that. It could be one of like an activity day or something of that nature, right? So so now that we're here, like just be creative with your promotion. There is truly like very few bad ideas when it comes to promotion. Just let your imagination run wild. As long as it doesn't harm the materials or it doesn't harm any person, go ahead and try it out. You can always hope that things are going to connect with people. You don't necessarily know what's actually going to connect with people. So be creative, let your imagination run wild, and have fun with promoting your repository and your collections. So finally, we're going to talk about evaluating. How do you know if what you're doing is working? So I made this section pretty vague. In actuality, this is kind of like probably a little bit more about like how do you know that your outreach efforts are working, but really this section can be utilized for anything along the archival process. So if you want to know if people are accessing your finding aids, you can still use these same points for evaluation and figure that out. So like, then why do you want to evaluate? Well, truly, and to put it bluntly, only the people who you're trying to reach can tell you if you're actually reaching them. That's the only way that you're really going to know if what you're doing is working. It also will tell you areas that you need to work on. It will make it very apparent. So there are different types of evaluation, right? Different ways you can go about doing this. You can send out questionnaires, either email or digitally, or you can have forms in your researcher space that your researchers will fill out before they leave, something like that. So a questionnaire is really just like a short, to the point questionnaire about maybe like one topic. You can do different kind of interview techniques, which also too, like the exit interview, whenever it comes to reference services, absolutely falls into this. That's how we utilize it. Like we track here in the DRC, like we track those exit interviews and we quantify them and put them into a spreadsheet to know like how many researchers are we actually being able to say that like we have provided them with the information that they need. And then you could pursue surveys. So this is going to be a little more in depth. It's probably going to be about multiple topics when it comes to your repository. And there might be different types of questions that are involved in a survey. So you want to know though, like what are you trying to evaluate? There's really kind of three ideas to figure out like what you're trying to evaluate. And your evaluation can come from any of these. It can also be a combination of these. So you want to think about like what kind of processes can you evaluate? And then I have some, like questions that break that down a little further. What kind of impact is being made by like a specific program that you're putting on, or an experience that you're offering to your users? And then how is the outcome actually working? Like, is it working? Is it meeting expectations? Is it hitting goals? So these are kind of the topics that you want to think about whenever you're devising your evaluation. And then, of course, you can always build evaluations on Google Forms or SurveyMonkey, or just send out email questions, or call someone on the phone and just quickly ask them some questions. Any of that absolutely works when it comes to evaluation. But one of the most important parts of evaluation is compiling it all and making it quantifiable. So in some way, shape, or form, you need to figure out how you're going to really be tracking it. Even if the answers are like yes or no and they're not number answers, well, you can count all the yeses and you can count all the nos, and then you have numbers that way, and it's going to tell you the answers that you're looking for, right? So you need to put all the data together. And I mean, I love a great Excel spreadsheet. Excel is amazing. You can use it for so many different things, and it's perfect for compiling all of your evaluation data. And, you know, while you have Excel open, go ahead and make visualizations. You don't have to use Excel. There are lots of really incredible free visualization makers that are on online. Like just Google them, you'll find them really easily. Because it's important to have a visualization so that you can tell people, instead of just telling people something, you can show them and say, like, look at this amazing progress we've made. And that all wraps up into outreach, that all wraps up into advocacy. You know, saying something like, we're doing a great job is great, but if you can show a graph that says like, no, literally, we're doing a great job, and here you can see that growth, that makes a bigger impact on people. And that sort of brings us to the end of the presentation. I have a couple of resources, a couple of additional resources that I've added. These are for, obviously they're for access, and then these are for outreach. They'll be available when the slides are sent out. They're really interesting, and particularly I think some of these for access are really interesting to look through, and they're really, there's a lot of really important points and good best practices that are mentioned throughout those. Here's my contact information if you have any questions or need any clarifications. And then I just want to plug Nicole's presentation next week. She's going to be doing the final presentation in our Archives 101 series. She's going to be talking about archival management. So it'll be next Thursday at 2 o'clock, just like today and all of the previous weeks. So we can go ahead and do questions if anybody has questions.
Thank you. That was an amazing amount of information. You shared it so organized. It's great. Thank you. We do have a question or two. One from Paige is, what are some good ways to initiate advocacy conversations? I think that's a good question.
Yeah, that's an amazing question. That's fantastic. So I would say to just honestly not really think about it. Just make advocacy a part of just like who you are. When you're talking to someone about your repository, you want to just know that what you're saying is advocating for your repository. Or if you have a more like direct thing that you need people to support, I would honestly write it out. Like write out the points that you want to make whenever you're talking to people, memorize those points, and then just kind of have an elevator speech ready to go. So an example of this is I fought for 5 years to get our sort of static finding aids that are online right now moved over to archive space. I wanted us to have archive space because it was just more intuitive. It was more, it's just easier for our researchers. And I think it's going to increase our accessibility to incredible amounts. And I'm really excited about it. Well, it took me 5 years to advocate for it until it's actually happening. We're going to go live with our archive space in January, and I'm super excited about it. And because I spent those 5 years doing kind of targeted advocacy, we were able to finally get there. So the way that I went about it was saying, like, what's my end goal? Who do I need to talk to about this? And then it's just sort of like, it's not subterfuge, but it's a little subterfuge, right? Like you want to be able to go in almost a casual conversation with someone and say like, you know, have you been on our website in a long time? Like, do you know how our finding aids are presented? Like there's this database that's really cool. That would be awesome. And then just kind of like walk away. And then maybe like a week later or something, come back and say like, I was talking about that database that would be really cool for our archive. And like, man, I just had a researcher the other day say like, wow, that would be really cool. If we were able to keyword search our stuff. And then you just keep doing that. And eventually they're going to be telling someone else about like, hey, like Kara has this idea about having this like archive space thing. And it's eventually going to get to somebody who's going to say, that's a great idea. I'm going to fund it and we're going to make it happen. And that's basically what happened. What happened here at the Cowboy.
I think that's really funny. It's like your subtle way to draw drop your stats, but I like what you said about, being able to write out what it is, like write out your end goal, write out what your reasoning and what your sort of supporting data is towards what it is that you are trying to advocate for really helps tremendously. And whether that's making a presentation or making a formal ask or whatever to administrators, or whether that's trying to be like, hey, a big problem and how we could solve it. I do think that that's really helpful. Okay, a question here too about how do you begin the process of creating a finding aid, which I know is a bigger question. So even if it's pointing towards places to get more information.
Yeah, absolutely. I would encourage you to go on OAA's website and look under the resources tab and watch Jennifer Green's presentation from last week about arrangement and description. She goes all over, she talks all about creating finding aids and the different ways that you can do that.
Good point. Okay. So let's see. There was also, I think, a conversation about different survey tools also being like Airtable or Google Forms too. So any other questions? And you all can feel free also to unmute yourselves and ask if you would like to be able to communicate that way. I'm just about to put the webinar recordings.
Hey, this is Kera Newrohr at the OSU Library, and I just want to give a shout out to Kera Newby. They're participating in the Listen OK database of oral histories throughout Oklahoma that, thanks to Sarah, we've started here at the library. And so we invite partners to send us inventories of their collections, and we roll them into a statewide guide. And it's available freely online for researchers. And Kara has sent me 2 collections now to add to the guide. And somebody already found her collection through the Listen OK guide. And we were able to connect them, and she was able to provide them with an interview that they were interested in. So thank you, Kara, for that, and look forward to receiving the other collection whenever you have time to send it. But if anybody wants information about that, feel free to contact me. I'll put information in the chat.
Thanks, Karen. No, Listen OK is an absolutely amazing resource. That's just incredible. And we're really excited about having 2 of our oral history collections be available through Listen OK. The 3rd is coming. I think I've been saying that for about 1.5 years now, though. There's still some work that needs to be done.
It's okay.
But we will get it to you, Karen, I promise.
Archive space is pretty important. Yeah, I think, and but that actually goes along with the sort of concept of being creative in your ways to provide access and discoverability to collections, as well as try and figure out how to, put leverage for advocating in other spaces too. So that's a good point. So many great resources. I think I have maybe one more question that made me think about this, and that was sort of collective advocacy, following up with that. So there's institutional advocacy, but there's also organizational and collective advocacy. And I know, like, for example, the Oklahoma Archivists Association does work to be an advocate for archives in the state, and just like this Society for Southwest Archivists works to be an archives advocate in the region. And so I'm wondering if you want to talk even briefly about how archival organizations might be of use for organizations in that need advocacy space as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can find all the way up to like SAA. They do advocacy work at a national level. So there's all kinds of different levels where professional organizations are doing advocacy for archives. I think it's just really, it's like getting involved in those organizations, finding out, or just going to their websites, finding out what kind of advocacy work that they do, and then sort of piggybacking onto it, right? So being involved in the organization and being involved in that sort of advocacy action, I think is important. And also to like suggesting different ways that, archives as a whole can be advocated for, I think is really important. One of my really kind of like personal passions when it comes to archives is just kind of telling people what archives are. I think a lot of the time whenever you're talking with someone who maybe isn't a researcher or has never done any archival research before, they just don't really know what archives are, what a repository is, or anything like that. And so I think it's important to like get the word out there about just what an archives is. So one of the things that maybe like OAA does is every year we do, or every other year we do the bazaar, where this is really like public programming that's driven to inform Oklahoma citizens about different archival repositories across the state. So being involved in something like that gets your repository on a list where people are going to be looking at it, and maybe they'll be like, oh, there's something in this repository that would be super interesting to me, and they'll contact you. So I think it's just like being aware of what the different professional organizations are doing, and then making sure that you are involved in them, even if it's just submitting something to say, like put me on this list. And then your repository's name's on there, and they're advocating for you and on your behalf.
Thank you. And I also really briefly wanted to draw to just make a loop too about the comment earlier about the local context for traditional knowledge labels. I don't know if many people know about that, but it's actually a really great resource, especially if you're working with Indigenous or Native collections, and being able to reshape and reframe in the way that we indicate, like what kind of sort of representational material is in collections, but also like what access could and should look like, not just from a legal and an ethical, but also from like a culturally sensitive and appropriate space as well. So thank you. So I think at this point, if there are any other questions or any other discussions that people want to have, we're just a few more minutes out. Then I think we will go ahead and wrap up. We do have our last workshop next Friday. Next Thursday. My brain's already zoomed ahead to Halloween. I'm ready for the Halloween weekend, I guess. So we're so looking forward to that. Don't forget to mark your calendars for the Introduction to Scanning workshop coming up in December 8th. And as always, you can follow up with the education emails that you're getting, and please do fill out the survey form, which I will also send out in the emails. It's been really helpful. You all have been great. Thanks so much for everything.